We all love a glass of whiskey from time to time, but sometimes you want to elevate your experience a little bit. You don't want to have just a glass of whiskey. You want to have a little bit of a contrast on the side, or you want to have something that's going to enhance the flavors of the whiskey you're drinking. Well, for that, the best thing to do is a food pairing. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about doing a whiskey and food pairing. So we're going to have something that's maybe a little bit simple, a little bit salty, meaty, sweet, things like that can contrast and add flavors and really enhance your whiskey drinking experience. But first off, for that whiskey drinking experience, you need to have whiskey. And for me, I find that actually a peated whiskey, or whiskey that has a little bit of peat in it, is often very good for a whiskey pairing. Now you can go in with like a spicy bourbon, you can go in with like a sweet or smooth Irish whiskey, or you can go in with something that's a little bit smoky. They're all going to give you different kind of balances to your whiskey drinking experience. They're all going to give you a little bit of something different. But for me, I find a little bit of smoke in a peated whiskey can add a little bit of a backbone. It can add a little bit of like substance or structure to the whiskey that can then contrast with the flavors you get in food, because it adds almost like salt. When you add a little bit of salt to a meal, it enhances the flavors. The little bit of smoke enhances the flavors and lets you kind of pick out and contrast the flavors of the whiskey and the flavors of the food. This here is the dark silky whiskey. It's just kind of simple enough Irish whiskey. It's a blend. There's grain whiskey in there, there's malt whiskey in there, and there's peated malt whiskey in there. So it's not a completely peated whiskey. It's from the Schlieve Lake Distillery. They do a number of whiskeys that are even more peated and even less peated. I find this one nice, kind of middle of the road. Gives you a bit of smoke, but it's not the only thing you can taste. But speaking of taste, let's get into our first of the pairings. And for me, no whiskey and food pairing is complete without something like this, something simple. These are just kind of simple crackers and a little bit of water, because what you want to do is you want to be able to like take a little sip of whiskey and then have a little bit of a cracker, because that lets you kind of, I don't know, like reset your palate. It lets you have the flavor of the whiskey, have a little bit of cracker, have a little bit of water to wash it down, and then reset your palate, because that way you get to have the taste of the whiskey, have it all kind of go through your mouth, but then you reset your palate, because that way you can go into it again almost fresh. You can go into it and say, okay, great, I've tasted the whiskey, especially if it's something a bit stronger, like if it's got that spicy bourbon note or the bit of smoke. You don't want that to build up and be the only thing you can taste. Some crackers, some water, they let you reset your palate, especially if you're going to go and have other foods, because that way you can have a bit of food and you can go back to the crackers. You can go back and say, okay, cool, I've had nuts or meat or whatever else you're having. Have the bit of the cracker, reset your palate back, and then go in for a whiskey, especially also if you're going for multiple whiskeys. If you're going to have different kind of whiskeys, the crackers and water lets you come back and really kind of have an enjoyable experience that lets you experience everything in its own way. Next up is going to be something sweet. It's going to be the kind of classic chocolate. So for me, everyone always recommends dark chocolate, and dark chocolate with whiskey is great, especially if it's like a peated whiskey. If it's going to have that kind of dark, earthy note, the dark chocolate just has this kind of darker, earthy cocoa kind of note, and it works well with whiskeys. But I also find some milk chocolate, some white chocolate, they can also work really, really well, because when you want to kind of go through the experience, you can have that dark, almost like bitter dark chocolate, and you can go all the way up to a smooth, creamy white chocolate and get different kind of flavors. It lets you go, okay, does it work well? Does it contrast? Does it enhance the flavors? Are you going to create an experience where you got the whiskey over here and the chocolate over here, and that lets you experience it one way? Or are they going to be meeting in the middle and you get the kind of same notes and you enhance the flavors, and that also gives you a different experience? So for me, I always have the 3 different types of chocolate and go through them one by one and see which one works best. Some, like maybe with this one here, the white chocolate won't work. Maybe it will work, because you'll get that kind of like contrasting flavors, but it's always good to experiment. Speaking of experimenting with flavors, the next 2 ones I'm gonna have, well, it's only gonna be one thing, salty, but depending on what you want, you can go for things like these. These are salted and smoked almonds. They are really, really flavorful. They got a huge kind of punch of flavor right up front, but they are smoked. They have a kind of a smoky flavor to them. So you might need, again, a whiskey that has a bit of peat, or something that's very sweet, because those flavors they're very like strong. They're very contrasting. They will fight against something or they'll add to something. So if you don't want to be doing that, you can go for just plain old salted peanuts. Those are a bit of salt. Like I said, salt enhances flavors. If you go in, a bit of salted peanuts, give you that flavor and see, oh, does the whiskey dry out? Does it kind of enhance the flavor? Does it fight against it? A bit of salt, I think, on a little kind of a tasting menu is always really, really important to have that flavor contrast and see what it does to the whiskey you're drinking. Speaking of strong flavors and how they might impact on the whiskey you're drinking, next up, I'm gonna talk about a bit of meat. So these here, just some chorizo, some salami, and these kind of are very good, I think. Like a cured meat, a dried meat, has a lot of flavor and has like, obviously you can get simple ones, like these are all store-bought, but you can get really nice ones. And I think for a whiskey tasting, when you're doing something like this, you want like little thin slices. You don't want really massive strong slices, because this chorizo, really tasty but quite smoky, a little bit spicy, so you get a lot of flavor there. So you don't want to have this massive like side of meat. You don't want to be eating something and chewing it. You want to have a little nibble and then pair it against the whiskey, because again, you don't drink massive amounts of whiskey, you take little sips of it, so you want to have something about the same. For something meaty, I think a salami, a chorizo, maybe like a smoked bit of chicken, something like that is very nice, because it's small but it packs a lot of flavor into a very little bite, giving you a great experience to contrast. Obviously, you could pair it with like barbecued meats. You could go with something grilled, like hot meats, like little bits of bacon. Things like that can also work really well if you want something hot. But for me, like this here can sit out for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. It's not going to do anything because it's cured meat. So it's not like a bit of bacon or barbecue where the sauce might congeal or you need to serve it hot. Something like this, you can put it onto a table and leave it be, and then people can enjoy it over time. You don't need to be worrying about having hot food. Before the final one, I'm going to give a little honourable mention to two things I don't personally really like. Now, cheese is a big one for whiskey tastings. People love cheese. I personally, if it's not in a cheesecake or on a cheese pizza, I don't really like cheese, so I'm not going to be putting cheese on my personal kind of list of things to try. Also, cigars. Now, I said earlier, a bit of smoke can be nice, like those smoked almonds. Some people really like smoking, and they love smoking cigars. I don't like smoking, personal preference. You can do whatever you want, but I know some people love a bit of whiskey, a bit of a cigar, really great time. Some people have the whiskey and the cheese. Those are kind of honourable mentions that if you like those things, experiment around with them, different kind of flavors of cheese, different styles of cheese, get that kind of, like I said, try different flavors, try different whiskeys and see which one you like the best. But me personally, they're not going to be on my list. So what I am going to round the list out with is something a little bit fresh. And for this, a bit of fruit, a bit of apple slices. So for this here, I didn't go for like a juicy apple. I went for like a crispy apple, because for me, fruit, when you're doing whiskey tasting, you don't want a really juicy fruit. You don't want like a strawberry or like a raspberry, one of those really, really juicy fruits. You want something a bit crisp and a bit fresh. Again, it's almost like resetting your palate, because you get that crunch of the apple, the flavor of the apple, and then you can just kind of enjoy the whiskey. You can contrast it. You still get the sweetness, you still get that kind of little bit of juiciness, you get a little bit of like liquid in your mouth when you chew the apple, but it's not about the juice, it's about the flavor of the apple, because a lot of whiskeys, especially Irish whiskeys, do have like kind of orchard fruits, apples, pears, that kind of flavor. So I think that works really well with the apples. But again, you don't want like a really strong one, I wouldn't go so strong as to go for like a green apple, like a Granny Smith apple, something like this, like a red apple that has a bit of a crunch like that, I think works really well with a whiskey pairing. And what are your favorite choices for a whiskey pairing? Is it like me, where you have a little bit of an overlap with the chocolate and the fruit, giving you a little bit of sweetness, or the smoked almonds and the smoked meats, giving you again that little bit of overlap? What are your favorite pairings? Let me know down in the comments below, and while you're there, hit the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button. I put out whiskey reviews every Wednesday. I put out cocktail recipes featuring whiskey every Friday, and every now and then I put out a video like this on a Monday when I talk about whiskey. So if you want to see more like that, make sure you hit the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Slán.